mountain kept its secrets after dark. But tonight the dark brought company. 8 riders moved up the old road, their horses careful on the frost. No lanterns. Only the sound of leather and steel, and men who had been paid to finish something. At the edge of the trees, a torch flared to life. The man holding it smiled without humor. The flame climbed fast, faster than it should have on green timber. Inside the homestead, stone walls stood between the night and the firelight. A woman waited at the shuttered window, rifle across her knees. She did not pray. She did not pace. She simply listened to the mountain breathing around her. The first bullet found the window. Glass exploded inward. The shutter held. Then the smoke came, thick, from the workshop where the torch had done its work. She rose, chambered the round. The click was loud in the quiet room. The wagon rolled into Coldwater Bend on a Tuesday morning, which meant most of the town had nothing better to do than watch it arrive. The main street was unpaved, dirt that turned to sucking mud every time it rained, and in early spring it rained every other day without apology. The buildings on both sides were functional: a general store, a feed merchant, a saloon that doubled as the post office, because the postmaster found whiskey useful for the job, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly east, as if it had been listening to something in that direction for too long and had never quite straightened back up. At the far end of the street, a squat building with a hand-painted sign, Clarence Potts, Frontier Matrimonial Brokerage. Satisfaction guaranteed or negotiated, that last part. Or negotiated. Nobody in Coldwater Bend had ever fully made peace with that sign. Clarence Potts was already in the street when the wagon stopped. Small man. Made larger by his hat, which had been purchased when he was younger and heavier, and had never quite fit right since. His vest had 4 buttons, 3 of them matched. He had the eyes of a man who was always calculating something. And he smiled at the gathered crowd the way a man smiles at a room full of people he intends to charge money. "Gentlemen," he announced, spreading his arms like he was conducting something. "Your brides have arrived." The men gathered. 30, maybe 40 of them, made a sound that wasn't quite a cheer, more like anticipation wearing the shape of one. Something collective and forward-leaning that made the women inside the wagon go very still. There were 10 of them. The first woman who stepped down was named Clara. Small, fair-haired, young enough that life hadn't started editing her yet. The man who stepped forward, a rancher named Dolan, good land, bad manners, did so with his hat in his hands. Because even bad-mannered men understood, you made some effort when meeting someone you intended to marry. The second woman was chosen almost as fast. Then the third, then the fourth, fifth, sixth. Each one stepping into the light and finding someone stepping toward her. Nora Callahan watched from the far end of the bench. She had been watching for 20 minutes. She had counted. She had the particular stillness of a woman who has learned that stillness is its own kind of armor. Her canvas bag was pressed between her knees. Everything she owned was in it, which wasn't much, but it was hers. And she had carried it across an ocean and a continent, and 3 days in a jolting wagon, and she was not going to let go of it now. 7th, 8th, 9th, 9 women. 9 men stepping forward. And then there was Nora. She climbed down from the wagon. The laughter started almost immediately, not all of them. To be fair to Coldwater Bend. And she was trying to be fair, because fairness cost nothing even when everything else did it wasn't most of them. 4, maybe 5 men near the back. The kind of men who existed in every crowd in every town. Men whose entire social lives depended on finding something to be contemptuous of, so they could lean together for a moment and feel superior. One of them said something she couldn't hear clearly and didn't want to. The others responded with the particular quality of laughter that told her, without needing to hear the words, that it was about her size. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman. She had been a large woman her entire life, which was a fact she had stopped apologizing for somewhere around age 23. when she realized the apology never changed the fact, and only added humiliation on top of it. She was broad-shouldered, full-figured, auburn hair pinned back in a practical bun because the work she did not accommodate vanity. Green eyes that, when she was paying attention, and she was almost always paying attention, had the quality of directness that made some people uncomfortable. She stood in the mud of Coldwater Bend's Main Street. She looked at the remaining men, the ones who hadn't stepped forward, and she watched them look at her, then look away. It took about 45 seconds for the math to become undeniable. 9 women, 9 men, and Nora standing alone in front of a crowd that had reorganized itself, subtly without deciding to, leaving a small circle of empty space around her that felt like a verdict. Potts cleared his throat. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, though it was the discomfort of a man whose inventory system had failed. Not the discomfort of a man watching someone's dignity being publicly dismantled. "Well, now," he said, "it appears we have. She looks like she ate the other 9, said one of the men near the back. Loud enough to carry. More laughter. Some people looked away. A few of the chosen brides glanced at Nora with the careful pity of people who are relieved it isn't them and feel guilty about being relieved. Nora did not cry. She thought about it. The way your body sometimes makes the suggestion independently of your brain. A welling up behind the eyes, a tightening in the throat. The body's first instinct, which was run or collapse. She chose neither. She had gotten very good at choosing neither. She lifted her chin, and she said, not raising her voice, not performing anything, just saying it with the clarity of a woman who needed the record to be accurate. I can hear you. I want you to know that. The laughter sputtered. The man with tobacco stains on his teeth made a mock bow. My apologies, sweetheart. Didn't realize you had feelings. Potts stepped forward, clipboard materializing in his hands from nowhere. The refuge of a bureaucrat in an uncomfortable situation. Miss Callahan, I'm afraid the arrangement has concluded, without me, she said. I can see that. The contract allows for. I know what the contract allows. She had read it 4 times on the wagon. She read everything 4 times when she had nothing else to do, which on that wagon had been always. It says you return passage cost to women who aren't matched. I'd like my passage cost, please. It's more of a credit situation. I'd like my passage cost, Mr. Potts. Potts opened his mouth, looked at his clipboard, looked at the crowd, and began the specific brand of bureaucratic throat clearing that meant he was about to explain why. She wasn't going to get what she was asking for. And that was when the sound happened. Hooves, not fast, not panicked. The heavy ground-eating stride of a large horse carrying a large rider at a pace that wasn't urgent but wasn't casual either. The crowd shifted without quite meaning to. Because crowds are sensitive to that kind of approach the way animals are sensitive to weather changes. Something in the air pressure shifts, and your body knows before your brain does. The horse was a dark bay, wide through the chest, the kind of muscle that comes from real work, not careful feeding. Head high, ears forward, an animal that had opinions about where it was going and was going there, a man on it. People used the word big to describe Gus Weller, and it was accurate in the literal sense, but it didn't capture what he actually was, which was something else. He was tall, well over 6 feet in the saddle, broad across the shoulders in a way that made other large men look like they'd borrowed the shape and hadn't filled it in yet. Dark hair that he wore too long, past the collar of a coat that had been good once and had since been repaired in several places with careful, competent stitching. The stitching of a man who fixed things himself because there was no one else to fix them for him. His face was weathered, not old exactly, mid to late 30s maybe, but marked by weather, by expression, by whatever it was that had carved those lines at the corners of his eyes and set his jaw in that particular way. A scar ran along his right jaw from the corner of his mouth toward his ear, old, well-healed. The kind that came from something indecisive. He rode down the center of the street, and the crowd parted for him without him slowing down. Nobody said anything, which, more than anything else, told you everything you needed to know about how Coldwater Bend felt about Gus Weller. Nora watched him come. She was not a woman who looked away from things, so she didn't look away. He brought the horse to a stop about 15 feet from where she was standing. He looked at the crowd first. A slow, comprehensive look that covered the whole street, the way a man looks at a room when he enters it and wants to know where all the exits are. Then his eyes moved to Potts, then to the wagon, then to her. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "You the broker," Gus said, not to her, to Potts. The voice was deep. Not performed deep, just the natural register of someone who didn't pitch their voice up for company. Potts straightened. "Clarence Potts, Frontier Matrimonial. You still have women available?" The question landed in the crowd like a stone in still water, ripples moving outward, a nudge between two men, a whispered word. The physical shift of a group of people recalibrating their understanding of a situation. Potts blinked. He looked from Gus to Nora and back again, and Nora could see the precise moment the man understood what was being asked and decided he wasn't going to be the one to say the obvious thing first. "Well, there is one young woman who has not yet been. That is to say, I'll sign the contract," Gus said. He was still looking at Nora when he said it. The silence that followed had a different texture than the previous silence. That one had been empty. This one was full of disbelief and confusion, and the particular human need to understand something that doesn't make immediate sense. Then the tobacco-stained man near the back said, "You're joking," with a laugh in his voice that wasn't fully committed, like he wasn't sure whether he was allowed to find this funny, or whether it might end badly for him. Gus turned his head and looked at the man. Just looked at him. The laugh died. The man took a step backward. His friends went suddenly quiet. Gus looked back at Potts. "What do I need to sign?" The paperwork took 11 minutes. Nora knew because she counted. She stood to the side while Potts and Gus handled the contract at the fold-out table. Potts produced from the back of the wagon, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. The crowd didn't disperse. They reorganized at what they considered a safe observation distance, which was about 20 feet and wasn't really safe in any meaningful sense. But it made everyone feel better. She could hear fragments of it. Weller, of all people, probably lost his mind, been up there alone too long. Poor woman, doesn't know what she's walking into. That last one came from a woman near the front of the general store, middle-aged, kind face, worried eyes. She was watching Nora with an expression that Nora recognized as genuine concern from someone who didn't have enough information to be useful. Nora didn't walk over to reassure her because she wasn't sure she could. The truth was, her heart was doing something complicated that she couldn't quite organize into a feeling. There was relief in it, the basic animal relief of not being sent back, of not having to return to what she'd left in Boston with nothing to show for the crossing. There was something underneath the relief that she didn't want to call gratitude yet, because she didn't know what was being given to her, and whether it was a gift or a trap. And there was the sharp, uncomfortable awareness that a man she had never spoken a single word to had just made a decision about her life. And she had let him, and she'd had almost no other options, which made the letting feel less like choice and more like gravity. She was 31 years old, which meant she had stopped being naive around 26. After a sequence of events she thought of as the education when she was being careful, and thought of as everything that happened with Edmund when she was being honest, which she tried not to be too often, because it didn't help anything. She had come to Montana because she had run out of things to stay for. That was the honest version, the version she'd told herself on the ship, on the train, on the wagon, was that she was building something new. But underneath that story was the simpler truth that she was fleeing something old. And the new life was mostly just what she was replacing the old one with. She knew that. She'd known it for a while. She didn't know this man. She didn't know anything about him, except that the town was afraid of him, and that he had chosen her. Both of those things were information she didn't know how to process yet. Gus finished signing, straightened, came toward her. He stopped a respectful distance away. She noticed that. Whether it was respect for her, specifically, or just a general orientation toward not crowding people, she couldn't tell yet. Up close, he was even larger than he'd appeared on the horse. His hands, when she looked at them, were the hands of someone who built things. Knuckles roughed up, palms calloused. Two fingers on the left hand had healed slightly crooked from breaks that hadn't been set properly. "I have a wagon," he said. "Half a mile up the north road. I didn't bring it into town. Streets are narrow, and I don't like crowds." "All right," Nora said. He looked at her bag. "I can carry that. I'm fine." A pause. "Okay," he said. That was it. No sales pitch, no reassurance, no speech about what a wonderful opportunity this was, or how pleased he was to make her acquaintance. He turned and walked north. And Nora picked up her bag and followed him. And the crowd watched them go, with the focused attention of people who knew they would be talking about this for a very long time. Near the edge of the crowd, the tobacco-stained man stepped forward, loud enough for her to hear. "God help you, woman." Nora didn't turn around, didn't break stride. "I don't need help from anyone in Coldwater Bend," she said. "But thank you for the sentiment." The wagon was where he said it was, half a mile up the north road, pulled into a flat spot between two aspens where the horses could reach grass and water. It was a good wagon, better than Potts's, sturdy, canvas cover over the bed, waterproofed with something that smelled like pine resin. Supplies in the back, flour, dried beans, tools, coils of rope, practical things. The wagon of a man who thought ahead, about what he'd need. Gus checked the harnesses with the systematic attention of someone who checked things, because he understood that small oversights became large problems later. Nora put her bag in the back and stood there a moment, hands loose at her sides. "How far?" she asked. "To the mountain?" "Yes, 3 days. In good weather." He glanced at the sky. The sky had the particular shade of gray that meant it was thinking about rain and hadn't decided yet. 3 days. She understood that meant the weather might not cooperate, and that he considered her capable of inferring that without being told. "What's the place like?" she asked. He thought about that for a moment. She got the sense he wasn't stalling, that he was actually thinking about how to describe it accurately, rather than how to make it sound appealing. "Stone and timber," he said finally. "Solid. Warm in winter. Well, garden space. 2 main rooms on the ground floor, 3 above. Workshop in the back." "What kind of workshop?" A pause, fractionally longer than necessary. "General purpose." She noted that pause, filed it, let it go for now. "Can I ride up front?" she asked. "That's where the seat is." "I mean with you, not in the back." He looked at her, just for a moment, not assessing exactly. More like someone, making sure they were reading something correctly before responding. "Yeah," he said. They climbed up. The wagon started north, and Coldwater Bend fell behind them, invisible below the first line of trees, and Nora felt it disappear the way you feel something you've been carrying too long and finally leave your hands. For a long while, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. Exactly. It wasn't comfortable either. It was the particular silence of two people who don't know each other well enough to have anything obvious to say and are both, for different reasons, waiting to find out if the other person is who they appear to be. The road climbed almost immediately, because north of Coldwater Bend, the land rose toward the mountains with a seriousness that wasn't interested in gradual transitions. Aspens gave way to pines. The pines got bigger and older and darker. The air coming down from the slopes had an edge to it, cleaner than valley air, cooler, carrying the faint smell of something high up and cold. "Finally," Nora said. Why did you choose me?" It came out more direct than she'd planned, but she had never been good at softening things. And she figured a man who'd chosen her in front of a laughing crowd probably wasn't going to be easily offended. Gus kept his eyes on the road. 9 women came down off that wagon, he said. You were the only one who didn't look at the ground when they laughed. She absorbed that. That's not much of a reason to marry someone. It's enough of one, he said. For now, she thought about arguing with that. Then she thought about where she'd been 40 minutes ago, standing alone in a mud-soaked street while strangers laughed at her. And she decided that for now was, in fact, a reasonable starting place, better than nothing, better than a lot of things. My name is Nora Callahan, she said. I'm from County Cork, Ireland, by way of Boston, Massachusetts, where I spent the last 7 years working in a textile mill. A pause. I'm a hard worker. I can cook, though I'm not remarkable at it. I can read and write in English and Irish. I know. Some medicine, not a doctor's medicine, but practical things. I'm not sentimental, and I don't frighten easily. Another pause. I'm 31, Gus said nothing for a moment. Gus Weller, he said. I've been on the mountain 9 years. I don't get to town much. I noticed. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something in the direction of one. I'll try to keep things clear between us, he said. I don't always say things the way people expect. That's fine, Nora said. I'm not particularly delicate, he nodded. Once. The way you nod when something confirms what you already suspected. They rode in silence after that. The road climbed higher. The aspens were long behind them. The pines were enormous now, old-growth timber that had been standing long before anyone put a name on this territory. The air had a quality to it that she hadn't experienced since childhood in Cork, the particular cleanness of a place that doesn't have enough people in it yet to dirty the air with their presence. She didn't know with calloused palms. She didn't know what she was heading toward. She knew that with more certainty than she'd known anything in a long time. But she had stopped knowing what she was heading toward somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. And she had decided, sitting in a ship's bunk in a storm, that seemed personally motivated, that she was going to have to get comfortable with not knowing. So far. Somewhat comfortable the first night. They stopped in a clearing beside a creek. The water was fast and cold, and so clear you could count the stones on the bottom, if you had the patience for it. Gus set up camp with the economy of movement that comes from long practice. Fire going in under 10 minutes. Horses tethered where they could reach grass and water. 2 bedrolls laid out on opposite sides of the fire, without anything needing to be said about it. He cooked beans and salt pork. Nothing elegant, but warm, filling, seasoned with something she couldn't immediately identify that made it better than it had any right to be. What's in that? She asked. Wild onion. Some dried sage. Found them up the creek while I was washing up. He said it without looking up. Didn't take long. She looked at him across the fire. He was eating with a focused attention that she was beginning to understand wasn't rudeness. It was just that he was the kind of person who was fully present in whatever he was doing. When he ate, he ate. When he worked. There wasn't a lot of performance about him. No ambient awareness of how he appeared to other people, which meant he was either very confident or very solitary, or both. Tell me about the mountain, she said, and that, she discovered, was the right question. Because when he talked about the mountain, something changed in him. Not dramatically, not the kind of transformation that happens in stories where a person becomes unrecognizable when you find their subject. It was subtler than that. The set of his shoulders eased slightly. His voice, which was already low and not particularly varied, developed something like rhythm. He described the mountain the way someone describes a place they know better than any person. The north-facing slopes, where snow lasted into June. The natural springs that ran year-round and never froze because they came from deep in the earth. The meadow at 5,000 feet elevation, where elk gathered in late summer in numbers he'd tried once and given up on. The rock formations above the tree line and how they changed color through the day as the light moved. Red at dawn, pale gold by afternoon, a deep, almost purple at dusk that he'd tried once to paint, and failed because he couldn't get the color right. Nora listened. She didn't interrupt except once. "You paint," she said. He caught himself. The way someone catches themselves revealing something they hadn't planned to. "Sometimes," he said, and looked back at the fire. "I'd like to see that sometime," she said carefully. Not pushing, he didn't answer. Which she was beginning to understand was not the same as no. The fire burned lower. The creek talked to itself in the darkness. Somewhere up the slope, an owl called, and something answered it from farther away. Nora lay on her bedroll and looked up at the sky, which out here, away from any town, away from any gas lamp or coal fire, was a quantity of stars she had forgotten existed. She hadn't seen stars like that since childhood in Cork. Boston's sky was orange at night. The Milltown air was too thick for stars. She thought about the laughter in Coldwater Bend's Main Street. She thought about the tobacco-stained man and his friends. She thought about Potts's face when Gus appeared. She thought about what Gus had said across the fire. "You were the only one who didn't look at the ground." She didn't know if that was a compliment or just an observation. She decided it didn't matter much. She had ended the day somewhere other than where she'd started it, which was more than she could have said for a lot of days in recent memory. Across the fire, Gus was a large, still shape. Already asleep, or appearing to. She wasn't certain which. He slept on his back with his arms at his sides, which somehow seemed exactly right for him. The thing she noticed before she fell asleep and thought about again in the morning was that she wasn't afraid. She had expected to be afraid. She had lectured herself on the wagon of being practical and clear-eyed, had constructed in her mind an entire framework for managing fear by acknowledging it directly rather than pretending it wasn't there. And then she'd arrived in Coldwater Bend and been humiliated in public and chosen by a stranger that an entire town was frightened of. And she had followed him into the wilderness without knowing his last name until an hour into the trip. And she was not afraid. She couldn't fully account for it, so she filed it under things I'll understand later. And let herself sleep. The second day was harder. The climb steepened, and a rain that had been threatening since early morning made good on its threat around midday. Cold. Driving. Montana rain with real intentions. Coming sideways with a wind behind it that had decided the two of them were its particular problem. Gus stopped the wagon without being asked and produced oilskins from somewhere in the back. Handed one to Nora without comment. She pulled it on. They drove on through the rain, which did not stop being cold just because they were prepared for it. The road, where it was still a road, turned into the mud it had always secretly wanted to be. Then the left front wheel sank past the axle. The horses strained. The wagon didn't move. Gus climbed down without a word, went around to the sunk wheel, assessed it with the focused attention of a man who had dealt with this exact problem before. Because he probably had. He probably with this every spring. He knew exactly what it required. It required leverage, which required a pry board from the back of the wagon, which required both of them. "When I say now," Gus said, positioned on the high end of the board. "Put your weight here." He pointed to a spot 2 feet from the wheel. "Push down, not forward. Don't try to lift it. Let the board do that." Nora positioned herself where he'd pointed. The rain came down her back in a steady stream. The mud smelled like iron and old leaves. Now she pushed down. He threw his full weight onto the far end of the board. The wheels made a sucking sound as the mud released it. The horses lurched forward. The wagon moved. They were both coated in mud from the knees down and the left side up. Gus looked at his coat, which now had mud on it from shoulder to elbow. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I'm going to be honest," Nora said, scraping mud off her forearm. That is not how I planned to spend the afternoon. Something happened on his face. The fractional shift that in another person would have been a full laugh, but in him, manifested as a compression at the corners of his mouth and a change in his eyes. There and gone in less than a second. "You did it right," he said. "The push down, not forward. Most people instinctively push forward. It doesn't work. Most people haven't moved heavy equipment before," she said. He looked at her with something new in it. 7 years in a mill. "You'd be surprised what I've moved." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something confirmed his thinking. "Gus," he said. She looked at him. "Weller," he repeated. "Mr. Weller was my father. I don't use it." "Gus, then," she said. "Nora," he said, which was the first time he'd used her name, and she had the strange, private awareness of noticing that she didn't mind how it sounded when he said it. They drove the rest of the second day, in and out of rain. Stopped in the late afternoon, when the light failed in the way mountain light fails. Suddenly, completely, without apology, he built a fire. She boiled water for coffee, because they were both cold through, and coffee was what the situation required. He drank his black. She added the last of her sugar, measuring it carefully. She'd been measuring it in small amounts since the first morning, because she wasn't sure when she'd have access to more. He watched her do that. The careful measuring. Didn't say anything about it. But the next morning, when she woke up, there was a small paper packet of sugar sitting on top of her bag. She had no idea where it had come from. She hadn't seen him pack it. He was already outside when she found it. She could hear him. The rhythmic sound of him doing something with the horses. She put the packet in her coat pocket without saying anything. It seemed like the right way to handle it. The third day, the road pushed into a high meadow above the tree line, and Nora stopped breathing for a moment. The mountain rose ahead of them in every direction. Snow-capped above, green below. Enormous in the way of things that genuinely don't notice whether you're looking at them. The sky above was the particular blue that only exists at altitude. A blue with actual depth to it, like something you could fall into if you weren't careful. Alpine flowers in the meadow grass, tiny, deliberate, growing in the cracks of rock, with the stubbornness of things that have decided they belong somewhere and aren't asking permission. "There," Gus said. She followed where he was looking, and saw it, tucked into a fold of the mountain where a line of old pines provided shelter from the north wind. The homestead. Stone. Good, solid stone that looked like it had grown from the mountain rather than been placed on it. Timber roof dark with age and weatherproofing. 2 chimneys, windows that caught the afternoon light and threw it back. A structure attached to the back that would be the workshop. A garden space to the south, winter bare, but clearly well established. The orderly rows of someone who took it seriously. It was not a rough shelter. It was not the mountain lair of a dangerous hermit. It was a home, a considered one. She hadn't known what she'd expected. Something more rough-edged, maybe. Something that matched the stories a frightened town tells about a man it doesn't understand. "You built all of that?" she asked. "Most of it. Had help with the stonework the first year." A pause. "After that, alone, 9 years," she said. "Yeah." She looked at the homestead, then at the mountain, then at the man who had chosen her in front of a laughing crowd for a reason he still hadn't fully explained. He was looking at the homestead, too. At the home he had built stone by stone over 9 years. And there was something in his face she had not seen there before, and could not quite name. It looked, she thought, like the face of someone bringing something home that he hadn't known he'd been missing. She didn't say that. It seemed like too much, but she held it in her mind as they came down the last stretch of road toward the homestead, toward the next chapter of whatever this was, toward the mountain that was already, even from this distance, asking things of her she didn't yet know the names of. The horses' hooves crunched on frost-stiffened ground. The windows reflected the sky, and Nora Callahan, 31 years old, The woman nobody in Coldwater Bend had wanted. Arrived at the place that nobody in Coldwater Bend had known she was capable of deserving. She did not know yet what it would ask of her. But she was there. She had arrived. And in her experience, that was almost always where things actually started. The first morning at the homestead, Nora woke before dawn. She lay still for several minutes, listening to a silence so complete it had weight. In Boston, silence didn't exist. There was always the mill, always street noise, always someone in the next room on a cot that needed oil. On the wagon crossing the Atlantic, silence was only ever partial. Wind, waves, the groan of timber. But this was something different. This was a mountain deciding not to make noise, which was different from the absence of noise, and it took her a moment to understand that the pressure she felt against her ears was actually just the absence of everything she'd spent 7 years surrounded by. She got up. The room she'd been given was the larger of the two on the main floor. She had noticed that immediately and without commenting on it, because Gus's room, the smaller one tucked near the workshop door, was clearly his, and she did not yet know what to make of a man who gave the better room to a stranger and took the lesser one himself. The bed was real, wood-framed. A mattress stuffed with something that smelled like pine needles and dried grass, not soft, but honest. She pulled on her boots and coat and went out to look at the main room properly for the first time. Stone fireplace on the north wall, big enough to stand in. A table that could seat 8, though she suspected it never had. Shelves everywhere. But mostly, and this was the thing she noticed first, the eastern wall, floor to ceiling, every inch of it. Books, not decorative books. Read books, broken-spined, page-marked. Some repaired at the binding with careful strips of leather. Because they'd been read so many times, the covers had given out. She stood in front of those shelves in the gray pre-dawn light for a long time. Gus was already outside. She could hear him, or rather she could hear the rhythmic crack of an axe splitting wood. Very regular. The efficiency of someone who'd been doing it longing, enough that it required no conscious thought. She went out. He was around the south side of the homestead, working through a cord of pine. He didn't stop when she appeared, completed his current swing, set the split halves aside, looked at her. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "Kettle left side. I can see you've been up a while. I don't sleep past 4. She looked at the stack of split wood, already substantial. More than a morning's requirement. "Is this something that needs doing every day?" she asked. "Or are you working through something?" He paused. Next piece balanced on the block. "What do you mean?" "Some people split wood because there's wood to split. Some people split wood because they need somewhere to put something." He looked at her steadily. "There's wood to split," he said. "All right," she said, and went inside to find the coffee. It was good. Better than she'd expected. Dark, not bitter. Made with the care of someone who considered it an actual part of the day, rather than a functional requirement. She found a second cup on the shelf. Poured it. And when he came inside, 20 minutes later, she handed it to him without ceremony. He took it. "Drank. What needs doing today?" she asked. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him steadily. "I'm asking what needs doing." A pause. In the pause, she could feel him making a decision about something. "Cellar," he said finally. "Stores from winter. Need to know what carried through and what didn't." He set his cup down. "Garden needs turning as soon as the ground softens. Maybe 2 weeks. And the well rope needs replacing. I've been putting that off." He stopped. "I usually do this alone." "I know," she said. "Where's the cellar?" The cellar was carved into the rock beneath the homestead, cold. Dry. A space more tunnel than room. Lit by a lantern Gus kept hung by the entrance. The stores were organized with the precision of someone who understood that on a mountain in winter, organization was survival, not preference. Root vegetables in dry sand, smoked meat wrapped in cloth and hung from ceiling beams. Preserved goods in sealed crocks, each one labeled in a handwriting that was angular and careful, not beautiful, but exact. She went through everything methodically, called it through every thoughtfully, called up to Gus through the floor hatch when she found something that needed attention. 3 crocks of apple preserve with bad seals. A bag of dried corn that had gotten damp at the bottom. The smoked venison was good, better than she'd expected, wrapped well, in a cold enough space that it hadn't suffered through the winter. When she climbed back out, she had a list in her head. She told him directly. He listened without interrupting. "The corn's salvageable," he said when she finished. "If you spread it on the south-facing rock outside. Sun hits there first." "I figured," she said. "I'll do it after breakfast." He nodded, and then, which surprised her. "You know preserve work. I grew up on a farm in Cork. We preserved everything. You had to." A pause. Her mother's kitchen. The particular smell of a boiling pot in August. The way her mother wrote the dates on every lid in a handwriting so small it looked like code. My mother ran the house. My father ran the cattle, and everyone ran the pigs. Because the pigs didn't listen to anyone. She said it without thinking. Then heard herself, and felt the small suspicious ache of someone who's mentioned something they don't mention often. Her mother had been dead 11 years, her father 13. Anyway, she said, "I know preserve work." Gus was quiet for a moment. "The apple preserve," he said. "There's more apple on the east slope in fall than I can ever use." A pause. "I can show you where." Come autumn. Such a small thing, a practical future-oriented statement about apple trees. But it was the first time either of them had spoken about the future in any concrete way. And Nora noticed it the way you notice a light coming on in a window of a house you'd thought was empty. "All right," she said. "Show me in autumn." She spread the corn on the south-facing rock. The sun hit it by 9. She turned it twice through the morning, and by afternoon it was mostly right. And the 3 things together, the cellar work, the corn, the conversation about apple trees, her feel for the first time since leaving Boston, like she was doing something that connected to something else. Like she was inside a life rather than waiting to be admitted to one. That evening, she stood in front of the shelves for a long time. "May I borrow some of these?" she asked. Gus looked up from the table. "You don't have to ask. Which ones have you read the most?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he crossed to the shelves and ran his fingers along the spines in a way that was completely unconscious and completely revealing. A man reading his own library, the way other people trace familiar faces. He pulled out 3 volumes, set them on the table in front of her. Keats, A Natural History of the Montana Territory, and a novel she didn't immediately recognize. She turned it over. Cervantes, in Spanish. She looked up at him. "You read Spanish?" "I learned." He went back to the table, sat. "Winters are long. Are you fluent?" "Passable." I read better than I speak. Haven't had much occasion to speak it." She looked at the Cervantes, then at him. "Teach me some," she said. "Real words, not polite ones." He looked at her for a moment. "Why?" "Because winters are long," she said. And she watched surprised warmth move across his face before he could catch it and put it away. She found the music by accident. The way you find most things that matter, by being somewhere long enough that things reveal themselves without being forced. It was the 12th night at the Homestead. She'd gone to sleep early with a headache that had been building since afternoon. Woke around midnight to a sound coming through the floor. At first she thought it was an animal, something pressing against the outside wall. Then she lay still and listened more carefully, and understood it was coming from below. From the main room. And then, she corrected herself, from beyond the main room. From the workshop. Structured. Musical. The sound of someone playing something she didn't immediately recognize. She went downstairs without a candle. The main room was lit only by the fire, burned low, and by the faint light coming from the workshop door, which stood slightly open. She went to the door. Looked through the gap. Gus was sitting on a low bench in the back corner of the workshop, bent over an instrument that took her a moment to identify. A fiddle. But not played like a fiddle, held low across his knees, the way you'd hold something you were trying to keep close. His left hand pressing strings, his right drawing a bow across them, with a technique she'd never seen before. Something self-taught, something he'd figured out alone over years. The music it made was low, strange, plaintive in a way that didn't resolve the way music usually resolved. It kept moving towards something and then pulling back. Like a door someone was trying to open from the wrong side. He played for a long time. She stood at the door and listened without announcing herself. Because announcing herself felt like it would end something that needed to finish on its own terms. When he stopped, it was complete. Not interrupted, just done. He sat for a moment, with the bow still in his hand, looking at nothing in particular. Then he became aware of her. The way you become aware of someone in a doorway. A change in the air, a peripheral shift, and he turned. She waited for him to be angry, or at least uncomfortable. He was neither. He looked at her with something that was closer to being caught than to being angry. A brief, unguarded moment of a man who had been seen doing something private. "How long?" he asked. "Most of it. I should have said something." "No," he said. "It's all right." He looked at the fiddle across his knees. "I don't usually play when anyone can hear." "Why?" He thought about it. It doesn't sound like anything anyone would want to listen to. It's not songs, it's just." He stopped. "It's what happens when you think," she said. He looked up at her. "Yeah," he said. "Something like that." She came into the workshop, sat on a crate near the door, far enough that it wasn't crowding. She looked around the space properly for the first time. The workbench with its organized tools, the far wall, small framed paintings, all landscapes. All unmistakably the mountain outside, rendered in oils that were imperfect in ways that made them more honest rather than less. The color she'd heard him describe, the alpine purple at dusk, was there, close enough to write that she understood why he'd kept trying. "These are yours," she said. "They're not very good," he said. "The purple is nearly right." He looked at her with a kind of weariness she was beginning to understand. He wasn't used to responses that came from actual looking. Was used to people who praised reflexively or dismissed reflexively. And he had stopped bringing his work into either of those conversations a long time ago. "The light changes too fast," he said after a moment. "By the time I've mixed what I need, it's already something else." "Mix it in advance," she said. "Lay it out before the light changes." He was quiet. "I've tried that. I can never predict exactly." "You don't have to predict exactly. You just need to be close enough that the distance between what you mixed and what you're seeing is workable." A pause. "I'm not an artist. I don't know if that's even how it works." "It might," he said slowly, and she could see him actually considering it. Not agreeing to be agreeable, actually turning it over. That was something she'd been cataloging. He was not polite in the automatic way. He didn't smooth things over or agree to end conversations. If he agreed with you, it was because you'd actually convinced him of something. She found, to her own surprise, that she liked that. The harder thing to admit was that she was finding him, in general, easier to be around than she'd expected. Not comfortable in the sense of frictionless. They had already disagreed about two things: the best approach to the root vegetable storage, and whether the leaning steeple of a church represented structural failure or character. Gus had gone completely silent in the middle of the second disagreement when he needed to think, which made her feel like she was arguing with the mountain itself. But he had been present in a way that made the homestead feel inhabited rather than occupied. She was not disappearing into his world. She was existing in it. And there was a difference. 3 weeks in, the cellar work was done. The corn had been saved. The well rope had been replaced. The garden was still too frozen to turn. But Gus had pointed out which rows needed what first, and she'd been working out a planting order in her head, based on the drainage pattern she'd been observing. One evening, Nora came out of the workshop. She'd been looking at the tools, figuring out Which ones she'd need to learn, to find Gus at the main table. Something in front of him. A piece of paper. He'd been looking at it for a while, she could tell. The way he looked at things he was deciding how to say. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He slid the paper across the table. It was a hand-drawn map. Geological notations in the margins. Contour lines marking elevation, and on the north slope of the mountain, a marking she recognized from the textile mill supply maps. A vein indicator. And beside it, in Gus's angular handwriting, natural shaft. Widened year 3. She looked at it for a long moment, then looked at him. "There's silver under the north slope," he said. "I've known since the first year I built here." She kept her voice even. "Have you ever taken any out?" "No, why?" He looked at the map, then at his hands. "May and I didn't come here for silver. We came here to build something that was ours. Something that couldn't be turned into something else." A pause. His voice dropped slightly on the name. May. The first time he'd said it out loud in weeks, she suspected. Maybe longer. The moment anyone knew it was there, this would stop being a mountain and start being a mine. "Who else knows?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. Too long. "There were surveyors. In the south tree line, 3 months ago." He said finally. "I recognized what they were, the way they moved. What they were looking at 3 months ago." She counted. 3 months ago was February. It was now the 3rd week of May. He had known since before she arrived. Nora set the map down carefully on the table. She folded her hands in front of her. She looked at him, and she did not say the first 5 things that came into her mind. Because none of them were useful. And she had learned a long time ago that the words you say when you're angry are rarely the ones you actually mean. 10 minutes of silence. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't the mountain silence she'd come to find useful. It was the silence of 2 people sitting inside something that hadn't finished happening yet. Finally, "You were afraid of what I'd do if I knew." Not a question. "I didn't know you in February," he said. "It's May." She said, "I know." He met her eyes, didn't look away. That was the thing about him. He didn't look away from things even when it would be easier to, which was worse and better simultaneously. "I've been thinking about telling you since March," he said. "That's 2 months, Gus." "I know. What were you waiting for?" A pause. "I don't know," he said, and that was probably the most honest answer he could have given. Not an excuse, not a justification, just the truth that sometimes fear doesn't have a specific shape that you can identify and name. Sometimes it's just weight, and you carry it past the point of reason because putting it down requires a decision you're not sure you can afford to make. Nora stood up, went to the stove, poured herself the last of the evening's coffee, stood with her back to him for a moment. Then she turned around. "All right," she said. "Tell me everything you know about the Thover, and everything you know about whoever sent those surveyors. Because that was what you did when you found out the ground under your feet was different than you thought. You didn't leave, you didn't pretend it different. You found out exactly what different meant. And you decided from there." Gus looked at her. Something moved through his face. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated than that. He pulled the map back toward him, and he began to talk. "June arrived the way good things sometimes do. Quietly, without announcement, without asking whether you were ready. The ground softened. The garden plot Nora had been watching through the window for 2 weeks finally gave. She turned the first row on a Monday morning, and the soil came up dark and willing. The kind of soil that had been resting a long time and had opinions about what it wanted to grow. She worked the near rows. Gus worked the far ones on the days the workshop didn't claim him. And they developed the rhythm of people who have learned each other's pace without discussing it, when to talk. When not to. How close was too close, how far was too far. She planted onion sets and potato eyes and the bean seeds Gus had been carrying in a tin for 2 years, meaning to get them into the ground, never quite doing it. He told her where the drainage ran soft and where it ran hard. She told him where she was putting the squash. Based on where the afternoon light landed longest. Neither of them asked permission. They divided the knowing and got on with it. It was good work. The kind that leaves your back aching and your hands dirty and your mind clear of everything else. The Winchester was a different matter. She had asked Gus to teach her to shoot at the end of May. After the conversation about the silver. After she had spent 3 days thinking about what it meant, that surveyors had been in the tree line. That someone in an office somewhere was looking at maps of this mountain and seeing a number. She hadn't said specifically why she wanted to learn. She hadn't needed to. Gus had looked at her for a moment. The measuring look, not unfriendly, just careful, and then he had taken the Winchester down from the wall. He didn't rush it. He explained the mechanism first. Let her handle it unloaded until it felt like a known object, rather than a foreign one. Talked about the relationship between the front sight and the rear sight, in a way that started with geometry, before it got to skill. Because that was how he taught things. Starting from what something actually was before getting to what you did with it. Then they went out to the south-facing rock. The flat one where she'd dried the corn in her first weeks on the mountain. The mountain, she was learning, had a way of layering its own history on itself. She was not a natural shot, she didn't pretend to be. The first 5 rounds went places that were directionally correct but not precise, which Gus told her was a reasonable starting point, which she suspected was partly true and partly generous. "You're anticipating the trigger," he said, standing behind her and slightly to the left, close enough to correct, far enough to give her the shot. "You're tensing before it fires. Try to make it surprise you." "That sounds like bad advice." "It sounds like bad advice," he agreed. "It's actually correct. The ideal trigger pull is one where the gun fires while you're still in the middle of pressing, not when you decide it should. Your brain can't flinch at something it hasn't decided to cause yet." She tried it. The next shot was better. The one after that was better still. Close enough to center that she understood she wasn't hopeless. "Just untrained agon," he said. She shot through the afternoon until the light failed, until her shoulder had earned its soreness in the particular way of new skill being carved into a body. 8 out of 15 shots within a handspan of where she was aiming. "You'd be reliable inside 50 feet, Gus said. "That's too close for comfort." "Yes. Flat. Factual. So don't let anyone get that close." "Helpful," she said. "That compression happened at the corners of the mouth. You stop flinching after the first few rounds. Some people never do." She looked at the rifle. "My father could shoot. He was good at it. I always thought it was something you either had or didn't." "Some people have a natural feel for the mechanics," Gus said. "The rest of us put in the time." She looked at him. "Which were you?" "The rest of us," he said, and there was something in it. A small, deliberate honesty about his own ordinariness. She found it unexpectedly, and she acknowledged this only to herself, standing in the fading afternoon light, with a rifle in her hands and mud on her boots, tender. The evenings were the things she hadn't prepared for. Not bad. Just unexpected. After supper, Gus would go to the workshop, usually for an hour, sometimes 2. She'd hear the sounds of it, tools, or silence, or occasionally the low, strange notes of the fiddle, which she had learned to distinguish from the wind by now. She would sit in the main room with a book from his shelves, the Keats first, then the natural history. Then she started on a surveyor's journal she found behind 2 other volumes, evidently pushed to the back and not read in a while. It was dry, methodical, but it told her things about this territory that she found she wanted to know. When he came back from the workshop, he would pour himself the last of the evening's coffee and sit in the large chair by the fire, and they would read, or talk, or argue about something. The arguing, she had decided, was her favorite part. Not because she liked conflict, but because Gus argued like someone who actually wanted to know whether he was right. Not like someone who just wanted to win. He'd go quiet in the middle. That maddening, Complete stillness that made her feel like she was talking to geology. And then come back with a point that was usually good and occasionally infuriating, because she hadn't thought of it. "You do that on purpose," she said one evening, mid-argument about something from the natural history. "Do what? Go silent. While I'm still talking. You just stop. Like a lamp going out. I'm thinking. I can see that. It's very irritating. Would you prefer I respond before I've finished thinking?" She considered that. "No," she admitted. "That would be worse." Then he went back to his book. She looked at him for a moment. The firelight on the side of his face. The scar along his jaw catching the way that made it more visible. The book, held in hands that still had grease along the knuckles from whatever he'd been working on in the workshop. She went back to her own book, but she noted, only to herself, only in the private ledger she kept of things she wasn't ready to say out loud, that the quality of evenings in this room had become something she thought about during the day. Not in the way she'd thought about things with Edmund. Not the sharp, anxious monitoring of someone trying to track another person's mood in order to manage her own safety, just noticing that evenings existed, and that she was present in them. It was in the third week of June that she found out about Edmund, or rather, she told Gus. They'd been talking about Cork. He'd asked her about the farm, about what it was like, and she'd been telling him. And somewhere in the middle of describing the way the coast looked in August, when the light came off the Atlantic at a low angle and turned everything amber, she'd made a wrong turn. Into Boston, into the years after she'd arrived, into the mill, and then, before she'd quite decided to, into Edmund Farr. She told him the shape of it. Not every detail, but the shape. Edmund had been charming, good-looking. He had a talent for making her feel, in a room full of people, like she was the only person in it. And then, when they were alone, for making her feel like she was taking up too much space. Too loud. Too much. He'd done it without cruelty, which was somehow worse than cruelty. Because cruelty you could name. What Edmund had done had no clean name. It was just the slow, persistent work of someone chipping away at the edges of who she was, until she started doing the chipping herself. 3 years of making herself smaller and calling it practical. She told Gus this by the fire, on a night in late June, when the window glass had fogged from the warmth inside and the temperature difference outside. She told him without performance. Without the careful humility she'd learned to apply to stories about Edmund in Boston, where women nodded with the particular sympathy that meant they were relieved it hadn't happened to them. Gus listened. He didn't nod. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't say, "Oh, that's terrible," in the reflexive way. He just listened with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and his eyes on her face. Full attention. The kind that costs something to give, and is worth more because of that. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He was managing his own fear, he said. A man who does that, he's not managing a relationship. He's managing himself, and you were convenient. She looked at him. You were convenient to diminish, he said, because you were easy to see, big presence, direct. That's frightening to someone who needs to be the largest thing in the room. She hadn't thought of it that way. She had spent 3 years thinking there was something wrong with her. Something that needed reducing. Something that made her genuinely too much. The idea that it had been about Edmund's smallness, not her largeness, sat in her chest in a way she needed a moment to process. "Thank you," she said finally. Thank you." "It's true," he said, like accuracy was the only thing he could offer and also the only thing that mattered. She looked at the fire. What was she like? May. He was quiet. She waited. Not pushing. Just leaving the space there if he wanted it. She was better with people than I am, he said at last. She could walk into a room of strangers and know in 10 minutes who was worth knowing and who was performing. She was funny in a way I wasn't expecting when I met her. Dry, flat face when she said something, so you were never sure if she was joking until 3 seconds after. Then you'd feel slow for missing it. A pause. She had plans. For this place. She had a hole. She'd worked it out. Numbers and everything. What kind of plans? A real settlement. Bringing people up. Building something proper. He looked at the fire. Not just a homestead. A community. She sounds like someone who knew what she wanted. She always did. He said it simply. Without grief and without the absence of grief, which are two different things. It was just a fact. May had known what she wanted, and then she had been gone. And those two things existed simultaneously in him without either one, canceling the other out. I kept her notebook, he said. From that time. I haven't opened it, Nora didn't say anything for a moment. Where is it? Workshop. He looked toward the door, on the shelf behind the paint tins. I put it there 9 years ago, and I haven't. I've looked at it. The cover. But I haven't. She understood that. Sometimes the thing you most need to do is also the thing you most cannot do yet. And the difference between won't and can't is not stubbornness. It's the knowledge that some doors have to be opened from the inside, on their own schedule, or not at all. When you're ready, she said. He looked at her. Yeah, he said, and she understood he didn't mean soon. The chair appeared on a Wednesday evening in the first week of July. She came in from the garden at dusk, to find it on the table in the main room. Pine, joined without nails. The wood worked smooth enough that you could see the grain had been respected rather than just shaped. Low back, curved slightly in a way that suggested he'd thought about how a person actually sits, rather than how chairs are conventionally built. And carved into the back, small. Not elaborate, a pattern of aspen leaves along the top rail. She knew immediately it was for her. She didn't ask, didn't comment. She just pulled it to the fire and sat in it. It was exactly right, the height, the angle of the back, the way her weight settled into it. She fit in it in a way that didn't require adjusting herself to the chair at all, which meant he had at some point paid very close attention to how she sat, what she needed, and had said nothing about it. He came in from the workshop an hour later, saw her in it, said nothing. Gus, she said. He looked at her, thank you. He nodded, once, and went to pour his coffee. She watched him move through the room. The familiar economy of motion. The way he never wasted a gesture. She thought about 7 years in the mill. About the women she'd worked beside, women who'd never once had anyone notice how they preferred to sit, or what kind of light they read by, or whether they were cold. Women who had learned, the same way she had, to treat their own preferences as optional information. Someone had made her a chair, built for her specifically. She was not going to make a large thing of it, but she was going to remember it. Then the letter came. Gus went to Coldwater Bend for monthly supplies in the second week of July. He was gone 2 days, as usual. He returned in the late afternoon of the second day, with the wagon loaded, and something in his face that was different from when he'd left. Not the controlled blankness he used when he didn't want to be read. Something underneath that, working to contain itself. Not entirely succeeding. He unloaded the wagon in near silence. She helped without asking questions. She had learned that questions at the wrong moment with Gus produced nothing useful, that he would arrive at telling her in his own time if she gave him the space for it. After supper, he put a folded piece of paper on the table between them. Someone left that at Potts's office, he said, addressed to me. Potts said a man dropped it off while I was last in town and didn't give a name. She looked at him. He nodded once. Permission or confirmation or both. She picked it up and read it. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. The handwriting of someone who didn't write often but understood that presentation was part of intimidation. It was brief. It said that a businessman named Silas Vane, representing the Vane Territorial Mining Concern out of Helena, had acquired an interest in mineral rights adjacent to the mountain property. That recent geological surveys suggested the area contained significant silver deposits. That Mr. Vane would be interested in purchasing the property at a fair market assessment. That this offer was extended in good faith with the understanding that all parties would benefit from a civilized arrangement. The last line. Mr. Vane trusts that Mr. Weller understands the nature of alternatives to civilized arrangements. Nora set the letter down. She had read that last line 3 times, and each time it had meant the same thing. Wrapped in the language of business. But meaning the same thing. How long have you known? She asked. I told you. 3 months you told me about the surveyors. I mean this. She touched the letter. How long have you known this was coming? He met her eyes. Since February. You've been waiting for it. Yes. And you didn't tell me. A pause. I didn't know you in February. Gus, her voice was steady. She made it steady. It is July. He didn't look away. That was the thing about him. He never looked away when he was wrong. Which was, as she had noted before, simultaneously better and worse than a man who avoided your eyes. I know. What were you afraid I'd do? He thought about that. Genuinely thought about it, which meant the silence lasted longer than comfortable. I didn't know what it would change, he said finally. Between us. I didn't know you well enough to know, and then I did know you well enough, and I was. He stopped. Afraid, she said. Yes, one word. No decoration. No performance of remorse. Just the fact of it, placed in front of her to do with what she would. She picked up the letter again, read the last line once more. Folded it. Set it down. Tell me everything you know about Silas Vane. He knew enough. Vane had been acquiring mineral rights across the territory for 5 years. Some of what he acquired he actually purchased, some of it he took. There was a homesteader south of the Bitterroot Range, a man named Garrison. Vane had wanted his valley for a sluicing operation. Garrison had said no. 6 months later, Garrison's barn burned. 2 of his hands quit. Someone filed a contested claim on his water rights that tied him up in territorial courts for 2 years until he ran out of money and sold. That's how he works. Nora said. That's how he works. She stood up, went to the stove, not because she wanted coffee, because she needed to move while she thought. The rider I saw, she said, 3 weeks ago, down in the south tree line. You said he could be a hunter. He wasn't a hunter. No, she turned around. He was looking up, not down. Hunters look down, a pause. So Vane already has men watching this place. He's been watching since at least April. And now he's sent the letter, because the watching told him enough to feel confident about the offer. She looked at the letter on the table. What does he know? He knows the surveys, what the surface geology suggests. He doesn't know about the shaft. He doesn't know the depth of the vein. Gus's voice was flat, even, not performing calm, just genuinely calculating. But he knows enough to know it's worth coming after. He also knows you're alone up here. A pause. He knew that when he sent the letter. He doesn't know that anymore. Something shifted in the room, not dramatic, not the kind of shift that announces itself, just the quiet recalibration of 2 people arriving at the same understanding at the same moment. We're not selling, she said. No, and we're not ignoring the letter. That's what he expects. He expects you to ignore it. Because you've been ignoring the world for 9 years, and he's counting on you to keep doing that. Gus looked at her. What do you want to do? She pulled her chair out from the table. Sat down. I want to write some letters. She wrote 4, the first, to the Territorial Land Office in Helena. Factual, precise, documenting the property deed, the homestead claim, the 9 years of continuous habitation and improvement. Establishing a paper record of ownership that predated any survey Vane had ordered, the second to the Millward Courier, addressed to the editor, a man named Ren Aldous, whose name she'd heard mentioned twice, in passing as someone who occasionally printed things that weren't convenient for people with money. She wrote carefully, not emotional, just what was happening, who was doing it, what the letter had said. The third to the Territorial Sheriff's Office, reporting a potential intimidation campaign against a private landowner, requesting that the record show the complaint was filed before any incident, not after. The fourth to Clarence Potts. That one was short, Dear Mr. Potts. The contract between myself and Mr. Weller is legal, voluntary, and properly documented. You have the signed papers. If anyone comes to you claiming otherwise, I would consider it a significant matter if you chose to confirm a lie. I would consider it equally significant if you chose to tell the truth. I trust you to make the calculation that best serves your business interests. Respectfully, Nora Callahan Weller. She didn't show Gus that one before sealing it. I watched her write. All four. Didn't interrupt. Didn't suggest changes. When she finished the last one, he said, "The land office. Is that where the deed is filed?" "Yes." "Good." She set the envelopes in a stack. "When you go to town next, these go with you. All of them. That's 3 weeks. Can you go sooner?"
He thought it.
"Week and a half. I need to go down for a fitting piece for the workshop anyway." "Week and a half," she said. "Then we know." He looked at the stack of letters, then at her. "Nora," she looked up. "He has money," Gus said, "and lawyers, and connections to people in Helena who owe him. A letter to the land office isn't going to." "I know what letters can and can't do," she said. "I'm not writing them because I think they'll stop him. I'm writing them because they create a record. Because when this goes where it's going, and it's going somewhere, Gus, you know it is, there will be documentation that tells the truth before the event, not after. Before." A pause. Before is different than after. Before means we were telling the truth from the beginning. After means we're defending ourselves. He was quiet. "Also," she said, "sitting here doing nothing would make me lose my mind." So, that compression happened at the corners of his mouth. "Brought the letters," he said. Prescott Hale arrived on a gray afternoon in the last week of July. He came up the road on one of those expensive horses that announce themselves before their rider does. Clean clothes, a hat that was tasteful rather than functional. He was perhaps 45, pleasant face. The kind of pleasant that was a professional tool rather than a natural state. He had dismounted a quarter-mile down the road, Nora noticed. His boots were clean, which meant he'd dismounted deliberately, far enough to walk in without mud. A man who managed his appearances. Nora was in the garden when he arrived. Gus was on the workshop roof, replacing a section of timber that had shifted through the winter. He heard the horse, came down the ladder, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who intended the other person to wait. "Most Weller," Hale said, pleasant smile, hand extended. "My name is Prescott Hale. I represent the Vane Territorial Mining Concern." "I got the letter," Gus said. "Then you know Mr. Vane is interested in a fair arrangement." "I know Mr. Vane is interested in something." A pause. "I haven't decided it's fair." Hale's smile stayed exactly where it was, the smile of a man who had this conversation regularly and knew every turn of it. "Mr. Vane is prepared to offer. I'm not interested in the number." A fractional adjustment in the smile. "Mr. Weller, the geological surveys are quite clear. The vein extends. The surveys are looking at the surface," Gus said. "I know this mountain better than anyone your employer sent up here. Whatever they told Vane, they told him what the surface suggests, not what's actually there. Even so." Hale glanced past Gus, toward the garden, toward Nora, who had straightened from the row she was working and was watching without pretending not to. "You have a wife now, I understand. A new arrangement. You might want to consider what's best for her situation as well as your own. A fresh start somewhere else. With the kind of money Mr. Vane is prepared to offer." "Mr. Hale." Both men looked at her. Nora walked from the garden. She didn't hurry. She wiped her hands on her work apron as she came. She stopped at the edge of the yard, looked at Prescott Hale with the kind of direct attention that some men found uncomfortable from a woman and that she had years ago stopped moderating. "You rode up here to make an offer. He's told you the answer is no." "I'm telling you the answer is no." She held his gaze. "The property isn't for sale. Not at a fair number, not at an unfair number, not for any number. Because a number isn't the point." Hale studied her for a moment, recalibrating. "Mrs. Weller, I think if you understood the full scope of—" "Miss Callahan," she said, "and I understand the full scope perfectly well. You're offering to buy something that doesn't belong to your employer, and never will." If Mr. Vane has questions about the property boundaries or the mineral rights, he's welcome to address them through the Territorial Land Office in Helena, where the deed is filed. A pause, which is the appropriate place for those conversations. Hale looked from her to Gus and back. The pleasant surface had cooled. Beneath it, something more calculating. "I'll convey your position to Mr. Vane," he said. "You do that," she said. He left. They watched him ride back down the road until the trees took him. Gus looked at her. "The Territorial Land Office," he said. "Is that where it's actually filed?" "Yes." She turned back toward the garden. "I mentioned it in my letter to them, which you mailed 10 days ago." A pause. "You planned that." "I planned several things." She picked up her trowel. "It's what I do when I'm worried." He looked at her for a moment, something in his face. Not the controlled expression she'd been cataloging over 2 months. Something behind all of those. "What else did you plan?" "I'll tell you if it becomes relevant," she said. "Go fix your roof." What neither of them said, standing in the yard after Hale's horse disappeared into the trees, the dust settling, the afternoon quiet coming back, was that she had called herself Miss Callahan, not Mrs. Weller. In front of a man who had tried to use the idea of a wife against them, she had said Miss Callahan. Her own name, her own identity, and she had also, in the same breath, made it abundantly clear that she and Gus Weller were a unified front, that there was no version of this negotiation that separated them, that there was no wife to appeal to separately, no fear to exploit, no soft target. What also went unsaid, that Gus had not corrected her, had not clarified, had stood there while she said Miss Callahan, and had simply let her be exactly who she was, while also being exactly what the situation needed, which was its own kind of statement. She thought about it that evening, and then put it in the category of things she was thinking about, but not yet saying, and went to sleep. Deke Sorrow arrived on a Thursday. He was a trapper, maybe 60, maybe older, the kind of face that had been weathered past the point of estimating. He came up to trade pelts twice a year, and didn't stay long either time, because he was a man who had found the precise amount of human contact that suited him, which was approximately 40 minutes, and had organized his life accordingly. He didn't dismount fully, sat his horse at the edge of the yard and delivered his information, the way you deliver something you're not sure the other person wants to hear, but feel obligated to say anyway. The story circulating through Millward Crossing, through Coldwater Bend, through the settlement at Cedar Flat, that Nora Callahan had been purchased illegally by a dangerous and unstable man, that she was being held on the mountain against her will, that someone needed to see to her welfare. And separately, almost incidentally, the way a card player slides the important card to the bottom of the deck. That the mountain property, sitting on a fortune in silver, might benefit from more responsible management. Deck said it plainly, without editorializing. "Without sympathy performance, thought you should know," he said. "Seeing as it's your life there's storytelling about." He left 40 minutes later, as promised. Nora stood in the yard after he'd gone. Gus stood beside her. The mountain was the same mountain it had always been, indifferent to everything happening at its base. To the men in Helena looking at maps and seeing a number. To the story traveling from town to town, gathering detail as it went, becoming something that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with what Silas Vance needed people to believe. What? "He's not attacking the mountain," she said. "No, he's attacking the story. Because the story is the only thing he needs. If enough people believe I'm a captive up here, then any action he takes gets framed as rescue, and rescue covers a multitude of sins." Gus looked at her. "What do? "We tell our own story," she said, louder and earlier, and with documentation. She turned toward the door. "Come inside. I need to write one more letter." She wrote it that evening, addressed to the Territorial Governor's office, not the sheriff, not the land office, the governor. She wrote it with the same precision she'd used for all the others. Clear, factual, chronological. She named Silas Vane. She named Prescott Hale. She named the letter. She described what Deke Sorrow had told them. She described the surveyors in the tree line. She described the armed men she expected, eventually, to arrive. She wrote, "I am a free woman, living on this property. By my own choice, I have been free since I arrived. I am free now. Anyone who tells you otherwise is doing so in service of a man who wants something that is not his to take." She signed it with her full name. Gus read it when she was done. He read it twice. "You know this might not arrive in time," she said. "I know. But it creates a record. And a record is the difference between what happened and what someone can claim happened." He was quiet. "Write it anyway," she said. "That's what I've decided. Write the true thing, even when the situation is bigger than one letter." He looked at her across the table, in the chair he had made for her, in the house he had built from stone. "All right," he said. 3 days later, Deke came back. He didn't stay 40 minutes this time. He barely dismounted. "Men in Coldwater Bend," he said. 8, maybe 10. "Asking about the North Road, asking about you." He looked at Gus. "Not surveyors, not lawyers. I know the type, and that's not the type." "When?" Gus asked. "They were there yesterday. Camped south of Millward last I heard." He looked at the sky, then at Nora, then back at Gus. 14 miles. If they pushed the pace. "Tomorrow night," Gus said. "Maybe before." Deke left. The yard was quiet. That specific quality of quiet that exists after bad news has finished arriving, and before you've decided what to do with it. Gus looked at Nora. "You can still go," he said. His voice was careful, low. Nothing in it was trying to push her. It was just the truth of what was possible, laid out for her to do with as she chose. Down the East Trail, it's passable on foot. You could be in Millward Crossing by morning. She looked at him. "And do what?" He didn't answer. "Go back to the wagon," she said. "Back to Potts's office? Back to standing in the mud while people decide what to do about me?" She shook her head. "Not with heat, just clarity. Wherever I go, Gus Vane's story follows me. Because the story isn't about me. It's about this." She gestured at the mountain. "At least here I have ground under my feet. At least here the story I'm part of is true." He was looking at her, with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something behind his usual expressions. Something that had been back there for a while, and was getting closer to the surface. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right. Do you think we can hold this?" "Actually hold it. Tell me what you actually think." He didn't give her the reassurance version. She could see him running the arithmetic. Honest arithmetic. The kind that doesn't round up for comfort. "I think we have a better chance than they're counting on," he said. "They expect a man alone and a woman who doesn't want to be here." A pause. "That's not what they're going to find." "No," she said. "It's not." They looked at each other across the yard. The mountain held its silence above them. "Then we don't run," he said. And those 4 words had more weight than most speeches she had ever heard in her life. Because they weren't a speech, they were a decision. Made by a man who had spent 9 years learning to live without making decisions that required another person. "We don't run," she agreed. The 11 days that followed had a particular quality. Not fear, exactly. Something more specific than fear. The quality of knowing that something is coming and having work to do before it arrives, and doing the work deliberately, because deliberateness is the only thing that keeps the waiting from becoming unbearable. Gus walked the perimeter of the property twice daily, morning and evening. Not because he expected to find anything, because knowing the ground was its own form of preparation. He knew where shadows fell at different hours. He knew which angles gave clear sight lines to the road, and which were blind. He knew the sound the wind made coming off the north slope versus the sound it made when something was moving through the trees below. Because those were different sounds, and he had spent 9 years learning to tell them apart. Nora watched him do it, and then started doing it herself, because 2 sets of eyes and ears were better than one, and because standing inside waiting to be useful was something she had decided long ago she was not built for. They reinforced the window shutters with iron brackets Gus had, in heavy ones, designed originally for a gate he'd planned and never built. They moved the most essential supplies from the cellar to the main room, filled every container in the homestead with water from the well, because fire was the obvious threat to a structure with any wood in it at all, and water was the obvious answer. And you did the obvious thing first, before you thought about clever things, Gus said. Clever things are for people who've handled the obvious things, she agreed. On the fifth day, she asked him to go over the rifles again. Not the mechanics this time, the decisions. When to fire a warning, when not to fire at all. What constituted a threat that required immediate response versus one that required waiting. What the difference looked like in practice, in the dark, under pressure, when your hands were doing the thing your brain was half a second behind on. He walked her through it the way he walked her through everything, from the actual structure of the problem before the application. When you decide to fire, he said, you've already fired. The decision can't happen in the moment you need the result. It has to happen before. Decide now. Yes. She looked at the Winchester. Inside 50 feet, she said. Anyone who comes through a door, yes. And a warning shot if they're in the yard and I have time. If you have time. And if I don't have time. He looked at her steadily. Then you don't. On the 9th evening, she sat across from him after supper and said, tell me about a book. He looked up. One of those. She gestured at the shelves. One you've read so many times it's falling apart. Tell me about it properly. Not the plot. What you actually think it's about. He looked at the shelves. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he got up and pulled down the Cervantes. Sat back down. And he talked, not a summary, not an explanation. The thing itself. The way the novel worked. And what he thought it was actually about. Which was not. He said what most people thought it was about. Most people thought it was about idealism meeting reality and losing. I think it's about the story you have to tell yourself to keep moving, he said. And what happens when that story cracks? Not when reality defeats you. When the story you needed turns out to have been a story. He said it with the slight uncertainty of someone who'd arrived at a conclusion alone. Over years of thinking, and wasn't entirely sure how it held up when said out loud. She looked at him. I think you're right. He looked up. You've read it? No. But what you described, yes. I've had one of those. She looked at the fire. The story I told myself was that I was practical. That everything I did was practical and therefore couldn't really be a mistake. Pause. Staying with Edmund was practical because leaving cost money and disruption. Staying at the mill was practical because the wage was reliable. Coming to Montana was practical because I had no other options. She looked at the fire. I told myself I was being practical right up until the moment I was standing alone in a mud street being laughed at by strangers. And then I had to admit that practical was maybe just the name I'd been giving to being afraid. Gus was quiet. And now, he said, she looked at him. Now I'm sitting in a chair someone made for me, in a house someone built from stone, waiting for a fight I didn't start but intend to finish. A pause. That's not practical at all. It's the least practical thing I've done in my life. Do you regret it? No, she said. Simply. Without qualifying it, he looked at her with that look. The one she had stopped being able to classify. Too much of several things at once for one word to cover it. He opened his mouth to say something. And then the sound came. Hoofbeats. Multiple. Coming up the road fast. Faster than the trapper had estimated. Faster than they had planned for. They both moved at the same moment. Neither of them leading. The momentum of 11 days of preparation, taking over from whatever the moment had almost been. The shutters went up, the rifles came down. Nora took the Winchester, because it was hers now. In the way things become yours, when you've put enough time and intention into learning them. And outside, on the road below, men who had been paid to take something that didn't belong to them, came up the mountain in the dark, not knowing what they were going to find. The first shot came before the riders reached the yard from the trees, east side, through the shuttered front window, buried itself in the far wall with a sound like a fist hitting stone, testing, or warning, usually both. Nora pressed her back flat against the wall beside the window, heart doing something loud and mechanical in her chest. Not panic. Not quite. More like the body saying, "This is real now. This is the real version of the thing you've been preparing for." She had expected to be more afraid. She was afraid. But it was a clean fear. The kind with edges. The kind you could work with. "Stay low," Gus said from the north window. "I know to stay low." 3 riders came into the yard. She could see them through the gap at the edge of the shutter, stopping at the yard's edge. One of them, the authority-shaped one, upright in the saddle, the bearing of a man who was used to other men doing what he said, called out toward the homestead. "Cuss Weller. We have a legal instrument from the Millward Crossing Sheriff's Office. Open the lodge. Come out peaceable." Gus moved to the window. Didn't open the shutter fully. Just the edge. Enough to speak through. Enough to see. "Hold the paper up in the yard," he said. "Light a match to it. I'll read it from here." Silence, which told her everything. Because a real instrument, a real legal document carried by real deputies, would have been held up immediately. You hold up the thing that protects you. You don't hesitate. You don't calculate. The hesitation was the answer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the man said. "I'm making it accurate," Gus said. "There's a difference." He moved back from the window. Looked at Nora, quiet. "Just information. 3 in the yard, at least 2 more in the east trees. Possibly 2 on the west. That's too many for a welfare check." They were never interested in welfare. The second shot took out the window glass. Entirely, the shutter held. But the glass behind it, the one small pane, she had cleaned twice since arriving, because she liked looking out of it in the morning, shattered, came down in a cascade of small pieces that caught what firelight remained and threw it briefly across the floor. Then more shots, rapid, not all from the same direction, testing the stone, seeing what the walls were made of. The walls were made of stone. Gus had chosen every piece, placed every piece, mortared every piece with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the difference between shelter and exposure was in the details of construction. The bullets hit and the stone absorbed them, with the indifference of something that had been standing since before any of this. That planned to continue standing after. "It's holding," she said. "It'll hold." And then she smelled it. Smoke, not the smoke of the fireplace. Different. Sharp. Pine hot. Coming from the east side of the building. From the workshop, someone had gone around. Someone had gotten a torch to the eastern wall of the workshop, where the timber sections met the stone foundation, and pine, that had been drying since last summer, was taking to it the way pine does. Fast. Committed. With genuine conviction. "Fire," she said. Gus was already moving through the workshop door. She heard it. The rush of air as it opened. The change in the smoke. She heard him hit the fire with the first water container. The hiss of it. Steam. More shots from the trees. They'd been watching for exactly this. For him to come out the back. For the fire to flush him. She went to the front window. Quick. Low. The way he'd taught her. She opened the shutter, left hand, controlled. No silhouette in the opening. And she put the Winchester to her shoulder, and she looked at the 3 men in the yard, who were watching the workshop side, 50 feet. Maybe less. She knew what she decided. She had decided it 11 days ago. She fired at the ground in front of the nearest horse. The horse went sideways, violent, sudden. The rider fought it, and for 5 seconds was nothing but a man trying to stay on an animal that had decided it was done with this situation. The other 2 riders scattered. The coordinated pressure on the workshop side broke 5 seconds. That was all. But 5 seconds was enough. Gus came back in through the workshop, scorched along the left forearm. She saw it, noted it, filed it under deal with later. He went straight to his window position. and they fell into the rhythm they had agreed on. Different angles, not crossing each other's fields, speaking only when there was information to pass. Two moved to the south tree line. I see them. Workshop roof is catching. How bad? East section. Not the whole thing. Can you? Not without going out again. Then leave it. He was quiet for a moment. She understood what that silence cost him. 9 years of work. The roof of the workshop. The place where he made things. Leave it, she said again. Firmly. We can rebuild a roof. The fire was the worst part. They got it out mostly. Gus made 2 more runs to the back with water while Nora held the front, but not before it took the upper section of the eastern workshop wall and part of the roof. The smoke it sent through the building settled into everything, into the wood of the shelves, into the pages of the books, into her lungs, which had opinions about this that she was going to have to ignore for the foreseeable future. She coughed through the second half of the fight in a way that was functionally impossible to suppress and deeply inconvenient. Every time she lined up a shot, she was also managing the particular indignity of her own respiratory system staging a protest. You all right? Gus said. From across the room, fine, she said, between coughs. Completely fine. This is fine. You don't sound fine. I'm fine, Gus. He said nothing further, which was the correct response. 2 of Vane's men were hit. She didn't know by which shots. The accounting was impossible in the dark, and the smoke, and the noise. Neither of them appeared fatally wounded. They were carried off by the others, rather than staying where they fell. Which told her something about the organization of the group. Someone was managing the retreat. Someone was thinking. The territorial deputies, the real ones, if that's what they were, had retreated to the tree line in the first 10 minutes and had mostly been watching, not participating. Which told her something about what kind of authority that paper actually carried. It lit. Then the front door came in, not the lock. The lock held. They had reinforced it, the door itself, frame and all. Something heavy being used as a ram against it. Multiple impacts, fast, the whole structure giving at once. And then it was down. 2 men came through fast. Low and moving, Nora was at the kitchen window. Not at a shooting angle. The Winchester was at the front window she'd just left. And between her and the Winchester were 2 armed men, who had done this calculation faster than she had. Her hands found the large clay water container, on the floor, beside the stove, 30 pounds. Full. She did not think about it. Thinking would have taken too long. The body made the decision that the mind was still catching up to, and she swung the container in a 2-handed arc at the near man. It hit him across the shoulder and chest. Not elegant, not tactical, just physics. 30 pounds of clay and water moving at speed into a human body that wasn't braced for it. He staggered. She got to the Winchester. Turned, 2 men in the doorway. Hard men. The kind hired because they don't frighten easily. They were running the arithmetic of a woman with a rifle, and whether she would actually use it. She could see them running it. I have been shooting this rifle for the past hour, she said. Clear, carrying. The same voice she'd used in Coldwater Ben's Main Street when she'd said, I can hear you. Not loud, just precise. I am not shaking. I am not afraid of you. The angle I have is a good one. Get out, the near one, the one she'd hit with the water container, looked at the other. Some communication passed between them. The specific nonverbal language of men who have done dangerous things together and can assess a situation without words. Then the near one took a step backward. The second one waited a moment longer. The arithmetic finishing, and then he followed. They backed out through the ruined doorway, into the yard, where Gus came around from the workshop side and stopped when he saw them. 2 men. Looking at Gus Weller at close range in the dark after an hour of fire and shots and everything that had preceded this moment, the arithmetic was very fast. They ran, the sound of hooves leaving multiple. Fast, going south down the mountain road, 4 minutes. Maybe less, before the sound faded. Then the mountain silence came back, complete, textured, filling in around the absence of everything that had just happened, the way water fills a hole in the ground. Slow, inevitable, thorough. Nora stood in the ruined doorway. The yard was empty. The east tree line was dark and still. The smell of smoke and spent powder was in everything. Her hair, her coat, the inside of her nose. She was going to be tasting this night for a week. Her hands. She noticed her hands were shaking. The delayed kind. The kind that waits until the thing is over and then arrives all at once. The body finally getting permission to react to what it's been through. She didn't try to stop it. She had learned long ago that the shaking was just the body filing its paperwork. It meant the thing was over. It meant she was still there to shake. She was still standing in the doorway when Gus came around the corner of the building into the yard. He was holding the Remington at his side, cut above his left eye, glass probably, dried blood along his temple, the burn on his forearm she'd noted earlier, and breathing harder than usual, not from exertion, exactly, from the particular expenditure of a person who has held a controlled state under pressure for a long time, is now in the process of releasing Ed, he said. When he saw her, she looked at him. She looked at him. The arm, she said. It's manageable. Fict. Show me. He came toward her. She pushed the sleeve back carefully, looked at the burn on his forearm, significant enough. The kind that would blister and needed proper dressing, but not the kind that went deep. She'd seen worse in the mill. Cotton fires moved fast and found skin before people could get clear. Inside, she said. They went in. The door she set aside, she'd deal with it in the morning. She pulled the fallen frame out of the way and left it. Some problems could wait until daylight. Gus sat at the table. She got the bandage cloth she'd prepared, the boiled water she'd set ready 3 days ago, and the salve she'd made from the dried herbs in the cellar stores. Arnica and pine resin. Old farm remedy, her mother's. Technically. Though her mother had never specified, it was for burns from a deliberate attack on a homestead. She dressed the burn without speaking, working carefully, the way you work on something that matters. He sat still for it, not rigidly, just with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that accepting care is not the same thing as needing to be taken care of, which is a distinction that takes most people a long time to arrive at. Some people never do. When she finished, she tied the bandage, sat back, looked at him across the table. The deputies, she said, the real ones. They saw everything. Yes, that's documentation, she said. What Vane told them, versus what they watched happen. They'll have to account for that. They will. He sent men to a private homestead under a welfare pretext. The welfare concern went in with rifles and a ram. She looked at the ruined doorway. That's not a story that holds together. No, he said. More slowly, turning it over, it doesn't. And my letters were already filed. Before tonight. She looked at him. Before is different than after. He looked at her. The cut above his eye had bled and dried. The burn on his arm was dressed. He looked like a man who had been through something, and was still in the process of deciding what it meant, which was exactly what he was. The firelight was low. The smoke was still in the air. The mountain was dark beyond the windows. You threw a water container at an armed man, he said. It was what I had. You could have. They didn't, she said, and I knew what I was doing. A pause, mostly. He looked at her with something she had learned to recognize was behind all his usual expressions, not the measured look of the early days, not the careful monitoring of a man deciding whether it was safe to trust something, just looking. The way you look at something you have decided matters. Nora, he said, Gus. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His was large, warm, despite everything that had happened to it tonight, burned along one side, newly. Hers was shaking, which she had mostly stopped trying to control, because the shaking was just the paperwork, and you let it file itself. He didn't say. She didn't say anything either. The fire had burned very low. The homestead was dark except for that. Outside, the mountain held its silence. The stars were there. She knew they were there, even without looking. The same staggering quantity she had noticed on her first night on the road from Coldwater Bend. Still there, still indifferent, still enough. He held her hand, she let him hold it. That was all. And it was completely sufficient. And after everything that had happened in the past several hours, the fire, the shots, the door, the water container, the two men in the doorway, the shaking hands. It was, in its quiet way, the most significant thing that had happened all night, eventually. Gus said, "The workshop roof in the morning," she said. "It'll need." "In the morning," she said again, firmly. He was quiet. "Yes," he said. "In the morning." Outside, the mountain went on being what it was. Inside, two people who had decided to stay sat in the dark, holding on. The morning came gray and cold and smelling of wet ash. Nora fixed the door. First. Not well. She didn't have the skill or the right tools to hang a new frame properly. And the frame itself was beyond saving anyway. What she did was prop the door back into the opening, with two lengths of timber braced at angles. Not elegant, not permanent, but it kept the cold out and preserved the basic sense of enclosure. She stood back and looked at it. Fine for now. She was applying that standard to everything this morning. Gus walked through the workshop in the early light, hands in his pockets. The controlled expression he used when he was managing something difficult. She watched him from the doorway, didn't follow him in. Some reckonings needed space. He came out after a few minutes. The burn on his arm was bandaged, and the cut above his eye had sealed overnight, and he looked, in the particular honesty of early morning light, like a man who had been through something real and was still in the middle of deciding what it meant. "How bad?" she asked. "East wall, upper section. Part of the roof." He looked at the damage without performance. 2 weeks of work, maybe 3. "I'll need timber from below the tree line. The tools? West side. They're fine. Then it's fixable." "Yes," he said. "It's fixable." She handed him coffee. He took it the way he took everything she offered, without ceremony, without performance, just acceptance, which she had come to understand was its own kind of trust. The specific trust of someone who has decided you are safe to receive things from. They stood in the yard, in the early morning, and drank their coffee, and looked at what the night had left them with, which was damage and survival, and the particular quiet of a place that has been through something and is still standing. 3 days later, the territorial sheriff arrived. His name was Aldous Frick, gray-haired, compact. He rode up with 2 deputies and the expression of someone who had read several conflicting accounts of a situation and intended to form his own opinion regardless of what any of those accounts said. He was thorough. 2 hours at the homestead, walking the property, examining the damage. The ruined doorway, the east workshop wall, the shot-through window shutter, the burn marks on the stone foundation where the fire had been set. He had a small leather notebook. He wrote in it with the steady attention of a man who understood that what he recorded now would matter later, and possibly for a long time. He spoke to them separately, which Nora respected. It was the right instinct. You interview people apart to see whether the accounts match without the accounts having coordinated. If they do match, the matching carries weight. Their accounts matched. Frick noted this without saying so directly. He read the copies of her letters. She had kept copies of everyone, which she'd had the foresight to make before sending the originals. Because she had learned at the mill that documentation only helps you if you can produce it. When asked, "These were filed before the incident," he said. He looked at her steadily, updating something. "The millward deputies gave a statement," he said. "Consistent with yours." "I thought they might," she said. "They were there to conduct a welfare check, not to participate in a land seizure. I imagine that distinction matters to them professionally." Frick put his hat on. "Silas Vane is a man with considerable resources," he said. "I want you to understand, what comes next will not be fast." "I know how institutions move," she said. "It may be difficult." She looked at him steadily. A man sent 10 armed men to my home in the middle of the night. A pause. I already know what difficult looks like. Sheriff Frick, he held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once slowly, the way people nod when they have finished reassessing something and arrived at a conclusion. I'll be in touch, he said. What came next was not fast. Frick had been right about that. It moved through the territorial legal system, the way serious things move through slow institutions, in increments, with paperwork at every stage. Delays that felt designed to outlast the people seeking resolution. Vane hired 3 lawyers. The Territorial Land Office opened a formal inquiry. 2 separate complaints were filed against the Millward Crossing Sheriff's Office for what the complaints termed an unlawful paramilitary operation, which was the kind of formal language that looked extreme until you remembered that 10 armed men had come up a mountain road in the dark to conduct a welfare check. Potts, to his credit and probably to his own surprise, told the truth. His deposition to the territorial court was straightforward. The arrangement between Nora Callahan and Gus Weller had been legal, voluntary, properly documented. He produced the paperwork. The papers were exactly what they said they were. No ambiguity, no technicalities. Just a signed contract, a witnessed agreement, and a broker who had, for once in his calculating life, decided that honesty was the better business decision. Vane's lawyers tried to argue technicalities around the nature of matrimonial brokerage contracts under territorial law. The territorial judge, a man not known for the speed of his opinions, dismissed that argument in under 20 minutes. The letters Nora had filed before the incident were, as she had told Gus they would be, the thing that mattered most. Before is different than after. Before means, this is the truth we are living in. After means, this is the story we are telling about what happened. The difference between those two things was the difference between the whole case. Gus learned all of this in pieces, by post. Letters arriving at irregular intervals through August and into September. He read them at the kitchen table, sometimes aloud to Nora, sometimes silently, then placed them in a tin box he kept on the shelf beside the Cervantes, which he said seemed appropriate. She agreed that it did. The piece in the Millward Courier came out in August. Ren Aldous had written it. She had not expected that. She had written to him in July, with the facts, and a request that he print them if he thought them print-worthy, and she had not been confident he would. Courage, she had observed over 31 years, was not evenly distributed. But he had. He had done more than print her letter. He had done his own investigation. He had spoken to the Millward deputies, to Deke Sorrow, to people in Coldwater Bend who remembered the day the wagon came in, who remembered 10 women stepping down from a wagon and 9 of them being chosen, and 1 of them standing in the mud and not looking at the ground and saying, clearly enough for people nearby to hear, I can hear you. I want you to know that. He had written it all down. The piece was picked up by a paper in Helena 3 weeks later, then by another publication further east. The story that traveled through the territory was no longer Vane's story about a captive woman on a dangerous mountain. It was a different story, about a woman who had been publicly humiliated and had refused to break, about a man who had been feared and misunderstood for 9 years, about 10 armed men who had come up a mountain in the dark and found more resistance than they'd planned for, about letters filed before the fact and a door propped with timber afterward, and 2 people who had decided not to run. People told that story. That was the thing Gus had said once, in a different context, a long time ago. The town decided I was something to tell stories about, what he hadn't accounted for, because he'd spent 9 years alone and had perhaps forgotten this. Stories could change. The same facts arranged differently, told from a different angle by someone who had actually looked rather than assumed, became a different story entirely. You forgot, she said one evening, reading him the piece from Helena, that the story could change. He was quiet for a moment. I forgot there was anyone who would bother to change it. She looked at him. There are always people who would bother. You just have to give them something true to work with. In September, the Territorial Land Office formally rejected Vane's mineral claim. His lawyers filed an appeal. The appeal was reviewed and denied in December. Two of the Millward deputies resigned from their positions, rather than face the departmental inquiry into their role in the incident. One of Vane's lawyers quietly stopped representing him. Vane himself, from what Frick reported in a brief letter that November, had redirected his attention to a copper operation in the western part of the territory. The mountain remained the mountain. October came the way it always did at altitude, suddenly. Completely, without consulting anyone's preferences, the aspens on the lower slopes turned all at once. Not gradually, not one tree at a time, but as a collective decision. A burning, spectacular yellow that moved down the mountain in a wave that Nora had not been prepared for. She stood at the south edge of the property and looked at it for a full 10 minutes. The first morning it was fully turned, just stood there, because it demanded to be looked at, because some things are simply too much to absorb while doing something else. Gus came and stood beside her. Neither of them said anything, which was by now a perfectly complete form of communication. He brought the painting out on a Wednesday afternoon. She was working through the last of the apple preserve. The east slope trees had been exactly as productive as he'd promised, and she had spent a satisfying, sticky week up processing the harvest. Her hands were still faintly stained with it, the particular red amber of apple preserves that doesn't come off entirely for days. He set the canvas on the table in the yard, said nothing. She looked at it, the mountain at dusk, her mountain. The view from the south-facing yard, the way it looked in that brief window when the light turned everything, that impossible purple blue she had heard him try to describe. On the second night of their journey, and had since watched every clear evening and never quite found words for either. He had gotten the color right, or close enough to right that the distance felt intentional rather than like failure. She looked at it for a long time. You mixed it in advance, she said. Like you said. How many attempts? 6. She looked at the painting, and then at the actual mountain, and then back at the painting. The thing about it, the thing that made it more than competent, more than the determined practice of a man who'd taught himself from books, was a quality of attention. The mountain in the painting was specific. This mountain, this hour. Seen by someone who had been looking at it long enough to understand the difference between what the light did on a clear evening and what it did when the air had moisture in it. You could only paint that kind of specificity if you loved what you were painting. And love, she had come to understand, was something Philgas had been doing quietly in relation to this mountain for 9 years, without calling it that, without knowing, maybe, that it had a name. Where will you hang it? She asked. I thought you might want it. For your room, she looked at him. It should be somewhere both of us can see it. Something moved across his face. Above the fireplace, he said. If you want, above the fireplace, she agreed. They hung it that evening. Too high on the first attempt, too far left on the second. On the third attempt, Gus hit his thumb with the hammer and said something in what she was fairly certain was Spanish, and not the polite kind. She laughed, actually laughed. The full kind. Not the careful kind she'd been rationing for years. Not the measured, socially appropriate laugh that knew its place and stayed in it. The kind that comes from somewhere real and doesn't ask permission first. Gus turned and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just injured himself and does not consider this the appropriate moment for amusement, which made her laugh harder. And then something happened on his face. The exasperation shifted, became something else. Something warmer and surprised and not quite in his control. He laughed, not long, not loud, but real. A sound she suspected most people in Coldwater Bend had never heard from him, had never been given the chance to hear. Because you only laugh like that, the surprised, unguarded kind, when you're somewhere safe enough to do it, They got the painting hung, stood back, looked at it. It was right. Not perfect, but right, which is the better of the two conditions and the rarer one. November arrived, first snow of the season, falling since midday. The world outside the homestead windows had gone white and still, and the fire was the center of everything. They were in their usual places. Gus in the large chair, Nora in the one he had made for her, the aspen leaf pattern along the back, the fit that required no adjustment. She was reading the Keats. She had read it twice now and had started marking certain pages, not all of them, the ones she wanted to come back to. "I want to ask you something," Gus said. She looked up. He had a letter in his hand. She hadn't seen him open it. From Ren Aldous at the Courier. He and his wife have been writing to ask if they could come up. "See the mountain," he said. He paused. He said, "It seems like the kind of place that wants to be seen." She looked at him. May's plan. He looked at the fire. She had numbers. She'd worked out how many people this land could support. What would need to be built first? What would take longer? A pause. "I still have her notebook, you mentioned it," Nora said quietly. "When we talked about the workshop, that you hadn't opened it. I opened it last month." She held that information carefully. She understood what it cost him to say. Not the opening itself, but the saying. The willingness to let someone know he had done it. That he had crossed that particular threshold alone, in the workshop, in the evening, and had come back from it, changed in some way he was still understanding. What was she like? Nora asked. A fuller version of the question than she'd asked before. A question that said, "I want to know her as a person, not just as the present she left behind." Gus thought about it. Really thought about it. Not reaching for the easy version. She was practical, he said. But not in the way that shuts things down. Practical in the way that opens things up. She'd look at a problem and see not what was wrong with it, but what it was actually asking for. A pause. She laughed more than I did, which wasn't difficult. But she laughed in a way that made other people want to say funnier things. Another pause, longer. She would have had opinions about everything in that cellar. She would have reorganized it within the first week and not mentioned it until I noticed on my own. Nora smiled at that. "She sounds like someone who knew how to be here," she said. "On the mountain. In the actual conditions of it. She was the one who chose this place," he said. "I found it on a map." She looked at the map and said, "That one." And I asked her why, and she said she couldn't explain it, she just knew. He looked at the fire. "She was usually right about things like that, the notebook," Nora said. "The plans she had for a settlement. Is that something you want to do?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he was still deciding. "I think it's something she wanted to do," he said. "And I think there's a difference between honoring that and living it." A pause. "I'd been treating them as the same thing. For a long time," Nora looked at him. "But they're not the same," he said. "Are they?" Not a question. "No," she said. "They're not." He set the notebook down on the table between them, not closing it, just setting it down. Open. Like something that had been kept in the dark long enough and could now afford a little light. Nora looked at the handwriting inside. May's handwriting. She didn't read it. That wasn't hers to read, but she looked at the shape of it, the way the letters leaned slightly forward. Like someone always in the middle of getting somewhere, someone who knew where she was going. She thought, "I would have liked her." She didn't say it out loud. Some things you hold. Not because they can't be said, but because saying them would make them smaller than they are. He looked at the letter in his hand. Aldous is a man who wrote the truth when it would have been easier not to. That's usually a sign. It is. And he has a wife, Gus said. Which means he's accustomed to someone who thinks differently than he does. That's useful for a community. Very practical, she said. He looked at the letter in his hand. Something shifted in him, not the expression exactly. Just the weight of it, lighter than before. Also a woman, he said. A widow. 2 children. She wrote a letter about what she could contribute and what she'd need. She didn't ask for charity. She just asked for consideration. What's her name? Cecilia Marsh. Wrote back to her. Nora said. I'll help you draft it. He nodded, the way he nodded when something confirmed what he'd already hoped. It wouldn't be fast, he said. Building what May imagined. It would take years. You built this homestead in 9 years, she said, and here it is, still standing. After everything, he looked at her. In her chair, in his house, on his mountain, and she looked back steadily, the way she had looked at things her whole life. Without looking away, that night the snow fell without urgency, just the mountain receiving another winter the way it received everything, by enduring it, by being what it was, unchanged in the ways that mattered. She was still reading, the Keats, open to a page she'd marked. The fire had burned down to a useful steadiness, the kind that asks nothing of you, just burns. Gus put his book down. Nora, she looked up. He sat forward slightly, elbows on his knees. Not the posture of a man who is comfortable with what he's about to say, but doing it anyway. Because he had apparently decided that discomfort was not a reason to remain silent indefinitely. I need to say something, he said, and I'm not going to say it well. She closed her book, set it down, gave him her full attention, because he had earned it, and she knew it, and he deserved to have it given clearly. You stayed, he said, when you didn't have to. When the reasonable thing was to leave. When I gave you a reason to leave, in May when I should have told you sooner and didn't. He paused, looked at his hands. I have been trying to find the right way to say what that means. Another pause. I don't think there is a right way. I think there's just the saying of it. She waited, not helping him find the words. That was his to do. He had earned the right to say it in his own way, on his own schedule, and she was not going to take that from him by finishing his sentences. You changed what this place is, he said. You changed what I think is possible here. And you changed, he stopped. What I think I am. The fire snapped once, quietly, like punctuation. I love you, he said. That's what I'm trying to say. I love you. She looked at him, this large, quiet, complicated man who had built a home from stone and a wall from grief and had spent 9 years inside both, who had read every book on those shelves and learned Spanish, and painted the same mountain 50 times, trying to get the color right, and played music alone in the workshop at midnight, and made her a chair she fit in exactly, and left sugar on her bag without being asked, who had ridden into Coldwater Bend on a supply run, and seen a woman standing alone in the mud and had made, as he had admitted himself, a quick decision, the kind he didn't usually make. She had known this was true before he said it. The way you know things that have been accumulating so long they become obvious. She had known it in the chair, in the sugar packet, in the way he'd held her hand in the dark after the siege without saying anything because nothing had needed saying. She had known it, and had waited for him to arrive at the knowing too. 'Cause some things need to travel from where they live to where they can be spoken. And that journey takes as long as it takes. I know, she said, and then, I love you too. He nodded once. The way he nodded when something confirmed what he'd already suspected but needed to hear. Which was, she thought, the most Gus Weller response imaginable. And she loved it for being exactly that, exactly him. Unperformed, undecorated, completely, entirely real. It was not a perfect moment. Her hands were still faintly stained with apple preserve that hadn't completely washed out. His arm still had the new bandage from the burn that would probably scar. The painting above the fireplace was 2 inches lower on the left than the right, a fact they had argued about briefly and decided to ignore. The workshop still smelled of new timber where they'd replaced the damaged section and would smell that way for another year before it settled into itself. None of it was smooth. None of it had come easy. It was the accumulation of hard work and harder conversations and the specific kind of courage it takes to stay in a place and be honest in it. Not the dramatic courage of a siege and a rifle, though that too, but the quieter, more sustained courage of deciding each morning to stop running from the thing you actually are. In the spring, they welcomed the first people to the mountain. Ren Aldous and his wife, who had opinions about everything and said so directly, which Gus found refreshing here after a lifetime of people who expressed opinions indirectly and expected you to decode them. Cecilia Marsh and her 2 children, a boy of 7 who immediately located every climbing surface on the property, and a girl of 5 who found the south-facing rock on her second day, 2 brothers from Cedar Flat, carpenters, looking for somewhere to put their skills into something permanent. It was not a grand settlement. Not yet. It was a beginning, which is all anything is at its start. Cecilia's children ran in the garden, while the adults worked. The younger one, the girl of 5, settled herself on the south-facing rock one morning, with the particular satisfaction of a child who has found exactly the right spot and knows it. Nora stopped what she was doing. Watched her. Good spot, Nora said. The girl looked up, the clear, unguarded eyes of a child who has not yet learned to be careful with strangers. It's warm, she said. It catches the light first, Nora said. Every morning. Before anywhere else. The girl looked at the rock, considering this information, deciding whether it was sufficient explanation. Okay, she said, and went back to whatever she was doing. Nora went back to her work, years later. And this is the part that travels, the way true things travel, from town to town, from person to person. Because they have the specific weight that only true things carry. Travelers passing through Coldwater Bend or Millward Crossing would hear about the settlement on the mountain. About the woman who had been left standing alone in a mud street. Who had ended the day somewhere completely different from where she'd started it. Who had put her hands in the mountain soil and learned its cold spots and its warm ones and decided it was hers. About the man who had built a fortress from grief and called it a home for 9 years. Who had let someone in, not gracefully, not without difficulty, but genuinely, all the way in, which is the only way that counts. About the letters filed before the fact, the door propped with timber afterward. The woman who threw a clay water container at an armed man because it was what she had. The painting above the fireplace, slightly crooked, that nobody had gotten around to fixing because it had become, somehow, exactly right. Some stories get better in the telling, some of them, the rare ones, are better than any telling. Because the telling can't quite hold everything the story actually was, what it was. 2 people who had each been broken in different ways by different things, who had found each other at the worst possible time, in the worst possible circumstances, with no particular reason to believe it would work, and who had decided, with the specific stubbornness of people who have nothing left to lose by being honest, to try anyway, on clear evenings, when the light came down at that low amber angle and the aspens caught it and threw it back. When the new-built structures on the mountain, the additions, the expanded garden, the second workshop that the Cedar Flat brothers had raised in a single week, caught the last of the day's warmth and held it. You could sometimes see 2 figures on the south-facing slope, near the flat rock where the light hit first in the morning. Standing side by side, not touching, not needing to. One large, one not, both of them facing the same direction. Below them the valley, around them the mountain, and between them, nothing that needed to be said. Not because they had become the same person, not because they had smoothed each other's edges into something comfortable and uncomplicated, but because they had learned, the hard way, the only real way, that the right person standing next to you does not make the world easier. They make it mean something. And on a mountain that had stood long before any of them arrived, and would stand long after all of them were gone. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.